go ahead and start. Uh, there may be a few latecomers coming on, but I'll just introduce the people on this call. This is a webinar co-sponsored by the upEND project. And I'm Ruth Malone from UCSF, and my colleagues Patricia McDaniel and Libby Smith are on as well. And we've co-developed this webinar series with our colleagues from ASH, Chris Bostic, and I believe Megan is also on this call, and Carol was not able to be on today. But just to kind of lay the groundwork about what this webinar series is trying to do, it was sort of a thought experiment, but we started thinking about how we always assume that smoking cessation is an individual thing, and that people who use tobacco need to stop. And that's all true. And of course, we want them to. But as we approach really thinking about the end game more broadly, we realized we need to be thinking about how to quit at a societal and institutional level. And what are the institutions that also need to quit tobacco? And how can we start characterizing smoking cessation more broadly so that those institutional actions are supporting the individuals who are trying to quit? Kind of the driving question here is, why should we put the whole burden of quitting tobacco on the individual who usually got hooked as a child or teenager? Why don't we as a society take steps with our institutions to make it easier for them to quit? And so with that in mind, we developed this series, and we'll appreciate all the feedback that you may have on it. As I said, it's to some degree, it's kind of a thought experiment to open our minds to thinking about this more broadly and to expanding our ideas of cessation. And so today, Chris Bostic from ASH is going to lead a discussion of one of the institutions that needs to quit tobacco, and that's the tobacco industry itself. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Chris.
Great. Thank you, Ruth. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Just need to get the right slide up here. All right. Are people seeing that? Great. Well, as Ruth said, this is the third in a series of webinars that are, like she said, a thought experiment on how we can think about getting rid of tobacco at the institutional and societal level. So I'm just going to start by giving away the ending here. The epidemic can't end until the tobacco industry disappears. There's no middle ground that we can find, but with them, there's a complete conflict of interest. Anti-tobacco activists have always envisioned a future without commercial tobacco, but it's only recently in the last few years that we've asked ourselves, what are we waiting for? What's going to happen that's going to trigger that other than us doing it? So when we talk about cessation, we usually mean individuals who smoke quitting for good. There are two major differences between smoking cessation and quitting the industry. The first is that cessation is focused on the individual, as well it should be. We need to meet those people where they are in order to maximize their chance of success. What we're talking about today is eliminating one of the most lucrative industries on earth, so we have our work cut out for us. The second difference is that individual cessation is voluntary. Virtually all tobacco control measures are aimed, at least partially, at convincing people to quit, but no one is forced to quit. For the tobacco industry, we will have to force the issue. So when it comes to quitting the tobacco epidemic, we need to think at the institutional level. Various aspects of society have become addicted to the tobacco trade. We need to get them to quit. Few will do so voluntarily, and for the tobacco industry, it's an impossibility that they'll do it voluntarily. They will never step down. If the CEO of a tobacco company suddenly found God or smashed his head and decided to quit selling products that kill people, they would be immediately fired by the board and another person put in charge that will sell those products. So they will not and cannot quit voluntarily. In the other quitting presentations, we have focused on 5 A's, but for this one, we're going to focus on 5 E's instead. And these are those E's: explain, examine, explore, expect, and emphasize. Let's start with explain, and by which we mean explain away the many myths that float around in the public mind. Myth number 1, The tobacco industry is just like any other industry. This is not a complete myth. All companies seek profit, usually for their shareholders. In general, they'll do anything short of illegal things to maximize that profit. Some, of course, do cross the legal line, and we hear about that all the time. The tobacco industry goes to extraordinary, slimy, loathsome lengths to maximize profit, but so do many other companies. What sets tobacco apart is the products they sell and the fact that they're allowed to sell them. In general, when a product is defective, it is supposed to be recalled and fixed. But companies don't do that out of the goodness of their hearts. They do it because it's financially more advantageous than the liability costs or the prospect of the government banning their product if they don't. But tobacco can't be fixed. And in spite of all the lawsuits, the math still works in favor of keeping it on the market, their math at least. And governments, with a few notable exceptions, have bent over backwards to ensure that not only is tobacco not banned, but hardly regulated at all, given its deadliness that's on every street corner. When you're talking to the public, make a few key points. First, it's not normal for an industry to be allowed to sell a product that is highly addictive and kills when used as intended. No one else gets to do this. We have banned the sale of lead paint, lead gasoline, asbestos, even lawn darts, because they were dangerous. Second, Congress has written the special status of the tobacco industry into law. When FDA was given authority to regulate tobacco in 2009, and up until then, that was the only consumer product that they didn't regulate, it made it explicitly clear that FDA cannot ban tobacco sales. Why did Congress do that? Because they knew if the FDA applied the same rubric to tobacco that applies to everything else, they would have no choice but to ban the sale. But from a communication standpoint, it's helpful to point out the sliminess of the tobacco industry's efforts to survive and thrive. I'll just give a few examples because it would take days to list them all. On the screen here, 1953, when concerns about the possible link between cigarettes and lung cancer were becoming impossible to ignore, the CEOs of all the major American tobacco companies met to discuss how to respond to the crisis. With the help of a public relations firm, they came up with a strategy of questioning the science linking smoking to disease and reassuring the public that they cared about their customers' health and intended to get to the bottom of this problem. They continue to obfuscate and gaslight for decades. From their own internal documents, we know what they knew and when. It was part of a planned, sustained, highly honed strategy to lie to the public and governments. And here's one of the most well-known examples of systematic lying, sometimes called the Seven Dwarfs. When 7 tobacco company CEOs were brought in to testify before a congressional committee in 1994, all 7 swore under oath that they believed that nicotine was not addictive and tobacco was not harmful. Everyone in the room and watching knew they were lying. This made the industry a pariah in the eyes of the public, but memories fade, and it's worth reminding them when you talk about the tobacco industry. Okay, myth number 2. The problem is people that smoke. I think the adoption of this myth is one of the industry's greatest achievements, and unfortunately, they were aided and abetted by much of the tobacco control community itself for decades. We know from polling that the public is a bit schizophrenic on this issue. The same person in the same interview can agree that the tobacco industry is to blame for the tobacco epidemic and that people who smoke are to blame for the tobacco epidemic. I think the key here is to emphasize that nearly all adults who smoke got addicted as children, before the age of consent. I'm personally not sure even an adult can consent to addiction. You can't consent to everything. There are certain things that you, like slavery, you cannot consent to. But in any case, children certainly can't consent to a lifetime of addiction. People who smoke were preyed upon by the tobacco industry as children and are the victims, not the perpetrators of the tobacco epidemic. Myth number 3, people have always smoked. It's normal. Before Europeans arrived and commercialized tobacco, tobacco was not used in at all the same manner that it is today. The industry has twisted a sacred product and turned it into the leading cause of preventable death, and the invention of the cigarette rolling machine was the turning point. Here's a graphic example of what I mean. This shows lung cancer deaths over the last century, over the 20th century. And you can see that it spiked amazingly from 1900 up until 1965 when it peaked for cigarette consumption peak, but in 1985, for men at least, lung cancer deaths peaked. When we look at when the cigarette rolling machine was invented in the late 19th century, it becomes incredibly obvious what's happening here. Lung cancer used to be so rare that when a doctor doing an autopsy came upon a case, he would try to preserve the corpse so that medical students could see it, because they might not see one in their entire careers. But if they did see one, they wouldn't have any idea what they were looking at unless they had an example. It just simply didn't happen very often. Myth number 4, the solution is better, less harmful tobacco products like e-cigarettes. Now, I'll be a bit controversial here. E-cigarettes are undoubtedly less harmful than combustible cigarettes, but that says almost nothing. Nothing is as dangerous as cigarettes. If you play Russian roulette with 3 bullets chambered, that's about the same odds as dying from tobacco if you smoke it all your life. So there's very little evidence, though, that e-cigarettes are helping people move away from smoking. And in the meantime, e-cigs are doing real harm to children, and we're getting more and more information on that. And let's always remember, addiction itself is a recognized disease. It would still be unethical to market e-cigs if nicotine were the only issue in play. There are proven FDA-approved cessation products. We don't need e-cigs, and we certainly don't owe the tobacco industry a soft landing as we end their business. Let's move on to examining the facts. First, the industry is not a stakeholder in public health. Their interests are diametrically opposed to those of us in the public health field. This also sets them apart from other industries. The innate and irreconcilable conflict of interest of the tobacco industry has been recognized in international law. Article 5.3 of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control obligates governments to deny the industry any input into public health policy. Now, the United States has not ratified the FCTC, so technically that obligation doesn't apply to us. But the conflict of interest is the same here as it is everywhere else. And if you ask someone in the federal government if we are in compliance with the FCTC, they will tell you that we are, but we are not. Part of that is because of First Amendment rights in this country, and we simply can't completely stop the tobacco industry from talking to decision makers, but we can do a lot more to insulate them from such interference. The industry, of course, works hard to remain at the table. Above is an early example. A frank statement to cigarette smokers was published in 448 newspapers in January of 1954. It pledged the industry's commitment to public health and announced the formation of the Tobacco Industry Research Committee, an organization supposedly devoted to research into all phases of tobacco use and health. The committee spent millions of dollars over 40 years on research designed to create and sustain the illusion that a controversy exists about the link between cigarette smoking and disease, and to reassure the public that the tobacco industry was tirelessly investigating this issue. The frank statement really represents the establishment of the tobacco industry's creation of doubt about its product. The idea that it hasn't been proven that cigarettes cause cancer, and the creation of doubt about the industry itself, may sell a potentially dangerous product, but at the same time, it's selflessly funding medical research to ensure that its customers are safe. And that's all a lie. This effort, and many that followed, can be considered a credibility project because its goal is to inspire confidence in the industry so that it can continue to exist and be successful and be treated just like any other industry, not special or unique in any way, just a normal industry. Next, one that we've already touched on. If a new product came onto the market tomorrow that was both highly addictive and deadly when used as intended, it would be removed from shelves immediately. And I don't think anyone doubts that. The CEO of that company, if it turns out they knew that it was both addictive and deadly, would be criminally charged for murder. And this has happened when CEOs knowingly allowed products to get onto the market that would harm people. The best example I can remember is about 10 years ago, there was a peanut butter company that found out that a batch of peanut butter had salmonella in it. And the CEO decided not to recall it. And I think 9 people died. That CEO will spend the rest of his life in prison for doing that. So certainly if you're killing people regularly with your product, the same ought to apply to you. So here are just 2 examples of products that used to be fine to sell, but were removed when we discovered how dangerous they were. heroin, and lead paint. Here's one of my favorites. The tobacco industry violates basic, universally recognized human rights every day just by marketing and selling tobacco and not doing anything else like bribery or smuggling or whatever. The human rights violation is their core business. This is not just me saying that. It has been recognized by human rights organizations and is incorporated into the Cape Town Declaration on Human Rights and a Tobacco-Free World, which was adopted by the World Conference on Tobacco or Health in 2018. We also have this concept in this country called consumer protection. It applies to every other commercial product except for tobacco. So according to the 2014 Surgeon General's report, cigarettes are far more dangerous today than in the past. And why is that? Because the industry has spent untold amounts on research to make them more addictive, easier to initiate, and harder to quit. The public often sees cigarettes as simply tubes of chopped up tobacco leaf, but in fact, it is one of the most highly engineered consumer products in history, and they continue to get better at keeping their customers addicted. Unlike other products that may have negative side effects or externalities, tobacco gives us nothing. The pleasure of that first puff in the morning is simply the alleviation of withdrawal symptoms. It doesn't reduce stress, it causes stress in the form of withdrawal. While doing their normal job is a violation of basic human rights, and in my opinion amounts to murder, the tobacco industry has done plenty of things that everyone agrees are illegal. In the US, my go-to example is the RICO case, of course. That was the longest civil trial in history, and the judge put them in the same category basically as mobsters, as racketeers. It showed decades of illegal activity to obfuscate the harms of their products. The industry long ago gave up on any credibility, but people need to be reminded of it. This is not simply a matter of malfeasance. The industry delayed life-saving policies. Their lives have caused millions of additional deaths. If we had been able to put policies in place earlier with the knowledge that the tobacco industry had, those lives would have been saved. Let's move on to exploring what can be done to force the tobacco industry to quit. At the most basic level, the industry is gone when they can't sell anything. Remember, though, that this is a goal, not a one-size-fits-all policy. There are many paths to getting to zero sales. Governments can do something straightforward, like ban sales, as Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach have done, or retail licenses can be phased out, or the fees for licenses increased progressively and dramatically until it makes no sense for a retailer to get one. There are many other ideas out there, and new ideas are cropping up almost daily. Some jurisdictions will require a longer path to get to zero sales, but there are some basic things that can be done to set it up, to get it in motion. A ban on new or transferred retailer licenses, or a sales ban based on birth date, also called the tobacco-free generation concept, or better yet, both at the same time, can be backstops to prevent the further spread of addiction and steadily reduce prevalence. Banning sales in certain venues, particularly pharmacies, will make a big difference as well. The Netherlands is taking this approach. They are progressively restricting what types of stores can sell tobacco until eventually none will be allowed. As we mentioned above, the idea of ending commercial sales is not radical. We do it all the time under consumer protection laws. My go-to example is lawn darts. Lawn darts sales were banned in the late 1980s in the United States, and they're still banned today. A lot of people on this call might not even know what I'm talking about because they haven't been available in their lifetimes. They were banned because 2 people were killed when they were misusing the lawn darts. They weren't even using them the way they were supposed to. Surely we can get rid of then a product that kills more than 2 people every 10 seconds by just its ordinary use. The industry knows it's a pariah, and they rarely show up to council meetings representing themselves. They work through other groups. Sometimes these groups have a parallel interest. Sometimes they are just hired guns, and sometimes they are hired and don't even know the issue, like the protesters in Sacramento around the flavor ban. Decision makers need to be made aware of ties to the tobacco industry so they can recognize the conflict of interest. And then we have money and politics. In every election cycle, the tobacco industry is the number one or number two donor to political campaigns. Sometimes big oil beats them. While we often think about this problem at the federal level, and it is a huge problem, it also happens at the state level. And California is too important a market for the tobacco industry to ignore. California has the fifth biggest economy on earth. So the tobacco industry is going to treat it like a major player in their field, even as prevalence goes down in California. So what kinds of challenges can we expect as we move forward on Endgame? Obviously, the tobacco industry is number one. They have fought every meaningful tobacco policy in history, but Endgame is a corporate death sentence to them, so we can expect them to fight it tooth and nail. They are among the richest industries in the world. They're nearly $1 trillion business globally. And as you can see in this graph, even in the United States, they are not presently on the verge of collapse. In terms of funding, this is not David versus Goliath. This is a 3-inch David action figure versus Goliath. But we have ethics, human rights, justice, and the facts on our side. There's a whole ecosystem of businesses tied to the tobacco trade, and we can expect them to make common cause with the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry has a long history of organizing retailers and other groups to speak for them, and they have worked hard to convince retailers that they will go out of business without tobacco sales. But some of the folks on this call from UCSF went down to Beverly Hills and Manhattan Beach a couple of years after their sales bans came into effect and talked to the retailers that were there. And there were two big takeaways, I think, from that research. The first is that none of them went out of business. All the retailers were still there. And the second is that while a lot of them were still angry about being forbidden from selling tobacco, especially when neighboring cities still allowed it, many of them just shrugged it off. It did not turn out to be a very big deal. So we need to continuously challenge the idea that banning tobacco sales will bring some sort of economic Armageddon. As we mentioned above, the tobacco industry gives millions of dollars to political campaigns, including in California. However, the more local the government, the less the cost of political campaigns, the fewer opportunities the industry has to use money to buy influence. So the industry is simply weaker at the local level. So that's where we can fight and win. And what about people who smoke? It seems obvious that they would be against us, but that's not what polls show. Polling shows that as a group, they are not our opponents on endgame policies. Polls in California, the US nationally, and in foreign countries have shown that in most cases, the majority of people who smoke are in favor of phasing out tobacco sales. A few years ago, we at ASH did some polling to determine messaging, what the best messaging would be on endgame. And we asked about support for endgame policies in 6 different ways. But no matter how we asked it, a majority of people who smoke were in favor of it. 2 polls in Europe really bring this home. In Spain and France, there were very large polls of citizens asking them if they would be in favor of a tobacco-free generation policy. 86% of the Spanish and 84% of the French said yes. Now, both of those countries have a 22% prevalence rate. So a significant number of people who smoke want to get rid of tobacco, especially for their children. We have to always remember that most people who smoke are addicted and wish they weren't. They want to quit, they wish they'd never started, and they are desperate that their kids don't get hooked on it. So we're down to our final E. It's a quick one. In all of our conversations with the public, with decision makers, with each other, we need to emphasize that the end of the epidemic is coming. It's a matter of when, not if. Once that is accepted, then the question becomes, why wait? And there's no good answer to that question. And when I say that the epidemic is going to end, it's not just because we know endgame policies are coming. If we follow the graph of prevalence, especially in California, it's going to end. We just want to make it end sooner. So retailers might as well get used to the idea that tobacco is going to go away. And just to circle back to our main point, the epidemic can't end until the industry is gone. And then finally, I want to put the end of the industry in the California context. As advocates, you are working in the biggest tobacco endgame laboratory in the world. California has set the pace of global endgame and has inspired other states and other countries, including New Zealand, which now has the strongest endgame laws in the world. The end of the tobacco industry began here. It is an amazing legacy, and I, for one, feel very privileged to be a part of it. especially as a non-Californian. So thank you. So here's some resources. This slide deck will be made available, and please don't hesitate to reach out to us at ASH or at upEND or any of the other technical assistance providers. We are here to support you, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chris. So for those of you who may have questions or just comments, please post them in the Q&A, which is down at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to field any questions or engage in discussion. There's a question of what LLAs, local lead agencies, can do at the local level to counter the industry, and thinking about that.
Sure, I can start and answer that, and everybody else can pipe in. I think given that we can't stop the tobacco industry from talking to decision makers, we need to go after transparency, shining a bright light on them and letting decision makers know that this huge conflict of interest exists there, and letting the public know that it exists. That's going to push some local decision makers to think twice about taking the industry side, because no one likes the tobacco industry.
Particularly in California, I think that it's certainly, after 30 years of industry denormalization, I think that is fairly widespread. Another question, are you familiar with the details for why British American Tobacco has to pay $600 million in sanctions? Were they selling to North Korea? I don't know about that, but maybe you do, Chris.
I know very, very little. I've just read the first news article that came out about it, but apparently British American Tobacco ran a scheme for several years to export tobacco products into North Korea, which violates sanctions against North Korea. They used every trick in the book. They used shell companies. They used banks that didn't have an obvious affiliation to the tobacco industry. It's pretty disgusting that they thought that it was so important to get cigarettes into North Korea. I mean, there are things that North Koreans actually need that there are sanctions on. So this is just an example of the repugnant ways that the tobacco industry will seek profit.
Other questions or comments from the group? I think we'd be very interested in hearing any feedback on, does this help in terms of thinking about broadening our work on cessation in any way? Is there any way that this could be useful in our individual cessation programs? I think that's a question that I have too. And maybe some of you who are working in cessation at the individual level or local levels can comment on that. Or maybe not.
I think there are a few more questions, Ruth.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I missed them appearing. Okay. I know some people feel fear of black market, but it sounds like those issues would be preferable compared to what we have to face now. And yeah, the concern about black market.
It's an important issue and one that we shouldn't ignore, but we should also realize that there is a black market now, and California already spends significant funds to stop illicit trade in tobacco products. And I think we also need to try to separate this from products that in the past black market has become a major issue for, like heroin and cocaine. Since we know that most tobacco users really want to quit, and there's help available for them to quit, if these products disappear from their local stores, very few of them are going to start to seek out a black market. It just wouldn't make sense, given that they want to quit. We've had anecdotally a number of smokers, including one today, that reached out to us and asked, "Can you get this stuff out of here? I've been trying to quit for 20 years. I can't, and because they're right in front of me." So while we do need to worry about the black market, we can't let that stop us from moving forward. We do have to be careful, though. There are ways to mitigate the risk of a black market, and I'll tell you a quick story about something that went bad in terms of black market and cigarettes. When COVID broke out, many countries stopped businesses that were non-essential and just closed them. most countries considered tobacco stores to be essential, so they didn't close them. South Africa did consider tobacco stores to be non-essential, and so they were closed. But they did it overnight without any notice and with almost no access to cessation. And the black market in South Africa exploded. And the government has not yet been able to claw back control over the tobacco market, which means that a lot of their other policies, especially taxation, don't work anymore. So we need to be cautious how we move forward. That's one of the reasons that we talk about phasing out tobacco sales as opposed to just overnight banning them.
Well, and I think that's another reason why doing it locality to locality, as opposed to sweeping all at once everywhere, is less of a problematic development in some ways. And I was also going to say something else about the black market idea, but now it's escaped me. So I'll ask the next question. Why, what do you know about the recent bill to end tobacco, why it didn't go through? This is the tobacco-free generation bills in California and Nevada. Do you want to comment on that, Chris?
Sure, and this is a tricky one. I remember when this bill surfaced, Ruth, you and I were on a call. We kind of had a bit of a chuckle moment because if this had come 5 years ago, we would have thrown a parade for TFG. But California has made so much progress at the local level in those 5 years that now it almost seemed like tobacco-free generation wasn't strong enough, that it would take too long. And there was a worry amongst some groups that it could distract from the great efforts that are being made at the local level. So the tobacco-free generation just didn't get widespread support from public health organizations. Some because they didn't think it went far enough, but also there are still those organizations who don't support endgame at all, and so they didn't sign on either. So a few groups, including ASH, did support it, but it just didn't have enough to go forward, and so that's why they decided to change the bill to reinforcing enforcement of the flavors ban.
Yeah, I think in the context of the flavor ban implementation issues that I think many of you are dealing with right now, that was another real factor in the levels of support. So hopefully we'll get something more related to that out of the effort. Another question, I know with education and advocacy, audience members tend to resonate with the data when it is in visual aid form or graphs. Do you have any sources to go to for visual aid data and graphs?
Yes, if you go to ASH's California website, we're the technical assistance provider for communications and media. So we've produced a lot of graphics there. If there are graphs or infographics that you think are missing, please do let us know. We're always looking for ways to help local advocates. And maybe Megan, you can type the address for the ASH California website in the chat.
I think I heard on a webinar that tobacco, like alcohol, has a very slim margin. Those sales are consistent because of dependency. I'm looking for data. Does anyone have ideas about that? About the margin on tobacco products?
I think there is data out there. I'm not an expert on it, but maybe Patricia or Libby, do you have ideas?
I always point people to this document from the National Park Service, which talks about recommended markups for different items in convenience stores in the national parks. It's not a perfect document, but it's updated and it's available. I have the link to it. It lists, how much of a markup things like cigarettes should have versus, candy and ice cream and whatever else. And the cigarette markup is much lower than the markup for other items. So that's just one source of data. I don't think I can post it in the chat to make it go to everyone, but I'll put it here. And then Megan, maybe you can make it go everywhere. So,
thank you, Patricia.
Okay.
And the next question reminds me of what I was going to say earlier. The question is, should tobacco industry tactics be part of the cessation counseling on an individual level, alleviate the guilt of addiction on the individual? And I have long felt that was a very promising approach. And I know some of the AATCLC people have developed some programs that focus on industry targeting of the Black community that they've worked to integrate into cessation programs. Because I think we know that, in fact, the industry targeted specific groups, that they promoted products heavily in certain areas and neighborhoods. And I think we also know that there is a literature showing that, in fact, if it is there's reduced retailer density or numbers, it makes it easier for people to quit smoking because it's not right there in front of them all the time, easily accessible. So anybody else want to add anything about that in terms of thinking about integrating industry tactics as part of cessation at the individual level?
Sure, a complete layman here. I don't know anything about psychology, and I'm not a cessation expert. But you may have noticed in my presentation, I try not to use the word smoker. I use people who smoke, adults who smoke. And that is because we're trying to reduce the stigma and take away the shame. And I would think if I put myself in the place of a person who smokes who wants to quit, and I feel shame at having started and gotten addicted, and you tell me all the things the tobacco industry did to prey on me when I was a kid, maybe we can turn that shame into anger. And that just seems like a healthier way to approach it to me anyway.
There's a question that says, do you think that the fact that a non-addictive level of nicotine has been discovered could delay the end of the tobacco industry? And I'm assuming that this is in reference to possible reduced nicotine cigarette policies at the FDA level, or that New Zealand is interested in implementing. Do you want to comment on that, Chris?
I can start, but I bet everybody has an opinion. This is a tricky one, because if you come at this from outside of our world, you say, okay, well, the problem with cigarettes is not the nicotine, it's the other stuff that's killing you. So why are you taking out the nicotine? But of course, we're taking out the nicotine because that's what people are after. That's why they smoke. And we don't know because there's not any data yet. But I think the reasoning here amongst researchers is that if the nicotine isn't there, kids won't get hooked and they won't go on to become adults who smoke. I think it's as simple as that.
And there's apparently a fair literature from clinical trials of these reduced nicotine cigarettes not developing dependency and being easier to quit. So I guess we'll see if anything ever actually happens at the federal level on this, and what happens in New Zealand. And Carol notes that ASH is about to produce its 2022 Tobacco Interference Index, which will be available in about 1 month. So there's another resource for you. Question, here's a good one for you, Chris. What about the issue of the UK giving out free vaping devices to smokers, including pregnant women, to quit? Would that imply that it is not an end, but a transition to vaping?
Anyone on the listservs that discussed this noticed that I did not participate. It's become personal in some ways. The UK is unique in the world right now. They are all in on using e-cigarettes as a way to move people who smoke away from combustible tobacco products. And that has made them a bit of a pariah in some people's eyes. I know most of the people in the UK that are working on this issue. They want to save lives as much as any of us, but they've taken a different tack. I personally don't think it's a great idea to give out e-cigs to folks. We have products that we know help in cessation. They're available. We could give those out instead. So it's an experiment. We'll have to wait and see what happens there. But I do make a call on people not to vilify people in the UK who are trying this.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that there is there's almost no discussion in the UK about actually doing anything to eliminate sales of combustible products that I've heard about anyway. Chris, maybe you have.
Well, they have an end game goal. It's 5% by 2030, I believe, and they're in the process of putting a plan together. That's one of the great things that New Zealand taught us. There were a lot of countries that had these end game goals, including our own, but most countries just had the goal. They didn't have any path to get there. New Zealand put together a very detailed path, and that has sparked interest in doing that in other countries.
So we will see what comes out of it. I think there, as Chris said, there could be many ways, many paths towards doing this, but certainly the UK is taking a somewhat different path. A comment, it's also about normalizing cessation of all kinds and being openly supportive and allowing our communities to know that struggling to quit is the norm rather than tobacco itself. I think normalizing quitting, across a whole community. We're becoming a tobacco-free community. We're becoming a healthy community. Those are the kinds of messages that I think most people do want to be healthy. So it's about tailoring those messages to the communities that most need them. And somebody says AB 935 is actually on the agenda at a government affairs or GO meeting happening right now, and posted a link to that.
I've got somebody inside the room sending me updates, and apparently they now have the votes to at least move forward.
Okay. I don't hear a lot about nicotine limits and other approaches that would revert commercial tobacco more like traditional tobacco, which I think we should be sensitive to. Your take on that?
Somewhat ironically, the United Kingdom has a limit on nicotine in e-cigarettes, and it's just to put it in context, a few years ago, Ash sued Juul, like everyone else. Everyone sued Juul, but we were suing them for putting the 3% and the 5% nicotine on the package, and obviously they did it so that people would think that, oh, well, I'm worried about being addicted, so I'll have the lower one. But that 3% wouldn't even be legal in the UK. Even that is an outrageous amount of nicotine. I'm not sure how much that helps. I'm not a scientist, but certainly more nicotine seems to equal more addiction, and so limiting, I think, is a good idea all around.
I think, but I think the other part of that question was, making commercial, reverting the whole idea of tobacco to more like traditional tobacco. I think traditional tobacco and maybe I'm misinterpreting the question, but I thought perhaps this is meant in terms of indigenous or tribal communities that use tobacco ceremonially. I'm not sure, I may be misinterpreting the question. Do you have any? I think
obviously it would be great if we could get it back to its sacred place in society.
yeah.
I don't see that happening globally, but one thing to keep in mind always is that California has a lot of Indian tribes, and a lot of them would like to get back to that and get rid of cigarettes, but continue to be allowed to use tobacco in a traditional way.
Cessation programs in Minnesota have not been effective, especially within communities of color. Is it worthy of our strategic planning to approve cessation programs?
Well, I wasn't aware of that data in Minnesota, but that's interesting. I'm a big proponent of cessation. For so many years, it was sort of the ugly stepchild of tobacco policy, because I think we're so focused on children and not on helping adults to quit. But I think we have an ethical obligation to give adults who smoke every opportunity to quit, because society allowed the industry to prey on them when they were children.
And I would just say that I think I would like us to be thinking of our cessation programs more imaginatively, because I'm not really convinced that in all cases, the people using these products see themselves as in need of a sort of medicalized version of quitting. And so I think that's where having a larger social conversation about, we all need to quit this. This is a product that's been very destructive to our society. Kind of helps expand that for the individuals who are using the products too. And I think that's part of our idea with this whole series, is to broaden that question. To prior question, one of our strategies is to have a minimum price and pack size. A retailer can keep the additional dollars from the higher price and save it for when all products are banned. And I know this is coming out of Marin County in particular. The idea of this minimum price during a transitional period that would then be given back to retailers to use explicitly for preparing for the time when they will no longer be permitted to sell. Chris, I don't know if you want to say more about that proposal. It's
Just
a
that
really interesting idea.
that's exactly it. This is unique. I kind of want to see it pass just so we can find out how well it works. And like I said, California is the end game laboratory right now. So I would encourage you to keep looking at that.
Yeah, I think, that's one of the things that's so exciting when Chris and I are on these calls that are with people globally who are working on end game things. It's just, there's so much excitement in California, and all of you who are leading some of these efforts are really, there are any number of ideas here that are bubbling to the surface. Karen Compton says CYAN and the California Youth Advocacy Network provides tobacco marketing tactics in their trainings, in their youth trainings. Really great resource, CYAN. Another question, how do you suggest we counter the industry's harm reduction talking points? Constantly a discussion. Yes.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think there's several points you could make. One, for me, primarily, it's how could we possibly trust them? They've lied to us on so many occasions in the past. Why would we possibly think that this time they have our best interests at heart? And as I said before, I'm not really an anti-e-cig zealot, but I don't see them as part of the solution whatsoever. And they are certainly harmful. We just don't know how harmful yet, and mostly harmful to children. And we shouldn't be okay with kids being preyed upon for lifelong addiction.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting to me because I'm beginning to see the sort of industry harm reduction narrative as the opposing narrative to the tobacco endgame narrative. And so, this is the industry's survival narrative. Now, there are some people in public health who do believe that e-cigarettes have a role to play. You have to really ask yourself, okay, if they have a role to play, then it must be as helping people get off cigarettes permanently and not use them anymore. And so if they are in fact effective for that, why haven't any of these companies sought to get them approved as cessation therapy? Because they could do that. They could apply to get them approved just like nicotine replacement therapy is, or inhalers, to become a cessation product, but they have not. And ultimately you have to think, well, if they were really effective for cessation, and if they were in fact not marketing them to kids to get new users who otherwise would not take up either tobacco use or e-cigarette use, then they're going to have a shrinking pool, a shrinking market, which is something that they probably don't want. So it kind of all doesn't add up. Some of the New Zealand colleagues have done a really nice analysis of this that we could send out if anybody's interested. And the question is, New Zealand doesn't include e-cigarettes, right? So yes, they are going the route, and they have some mixed feelings about that, but they are going the route of still of greatly reducing nicotine, greatly reducing by 95% or so the number of retailers that sell cigarettes, but still allowing e-cigarettes to be marketed. So they're seeing them as a sort of transitional product. Chris, I don't know if you want to comment
I
more on
just
that.
want to add that there's some misinformation that's floating around the global listservs that puts New Zealand in the same category as United Kingdom, but that's not really the case. They have not embraced e-cigarettes as the solution to smoking. They have simply started with the products that they know kill people, or at least kill almost all the people that get killed from tobacco products. They do plan to come back and regulate e-cigs, and they're doing research on that right now. They just didn't lump them all together.
I received a referral for someone who wanted to quit. A local primary care provider in California prescribed switching from combustible to e-cigarette to a patient who asked about quitting. I was a bit shocked, but it's good to know what guidance local providers need. Yeah.
This is
So-
always a tough one, isn't it? I'm sure everyone here has had family members or friends ask, like my nephew is smoking. What can we do? That kind of thing. From an individual standpoint, if I have an aunt that comes to me and says my son is smoking cigarettes, he's tried to quit but he can't. Should he switch to e-cigarettes? My answer is hell yes. Of course he should. If that's the only option, if it's either that or smoking combustible cigarettes, then yes, they should switch. But from a public health, from a broader standpoint, I don't embrace e-cigarettes.
Well, and I think the research is still somewhat mixed in terms of the effectiveness for staying off cigarettes. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people end up dual using for a while or then relapsing to cigarettes.
Yep.
Comment from Doug Matheny. Preliminary findings from a clinical smoking cessation program in Oklahoma suggest that greater awareness of the court findings from the racketeering verdict against tobacco companies was associated with increased rates of biochemically verified smoking abstinence, which is great. That I'd love to see that paper. Maybe you can put it in the chat, or I don't know if you can post to the chat, but anyway.
He can post the chat, and then he can actually to the chat. Yeah.
But again, it's sort of that idea of maybe there are multiple paths to motivating cessation for individuals. Give my money to these racketeers, to these exploitive companies. Maybe that's another route for people to mobilize themselves.
Just to add to that, a few years ago, Norway ran this fantastic public relations campaign where they depicted the tobacco industry as evil mobsters, and it basically said to people who are smoking or considering smoking, do you really want to give your money to these people? And it worked pretty well.
Somebody is just noting that there are 109 federally recognized tribes in California, and I think that's an important point to remember when we're having these discussions about endgame, is that they are also independent. They are what's the word I'm looking for? Sovereign, right? They are sovereign tribes, so they have authority to make decisions about their tribal governance and tribal lands, and so there are going to be challenges as we move towards endgame, and the tribes are definitely part of that conversation. Ashish is noting that Quebec proposed a nicotine limit as well as the size of the cartridge.
I've heard about it, but I don't have any details.
I heard the FDA was thinking about embarking on educating the public about reduced risk products. How will this affect smokers' interest in cessation? That's a tough one.
I'm not sure I have an answer for that. That could be helpful.
I know they're working on messaging. I think the whole issue of FDA regulation of tobacco products is very fraught because the public has, for decades thought of being a stamp of things being healthy or approved. And now, and this is always something that I worried about with FDA regulation, was that the public would then say, okay, well, this is approved by the FDA, so it must be okay. So I don't think we have the answer to that. I know they're doing research on messaging and communication about this, but I think it's very tricky because it's tricky too for different audiences. You don't want kids to think these are harmless products, but maybe you do want to convey to people who are heavily using combustible tobacco products that these might be a better option for them if they can get off the combustibles. It's a tricky, I don't know that, I haven't heard that they have kind of arrived at a way to do this yet. And someone is observing that Sonoma County has a minimum price ordinance. Yes, thank you, Sovereign. Okay, gosh, it looks like I've reached the bottom of this question or discussion, but if anybody has more, comments. This has been a great discussion.
Great questions. Can we capture it somehow when I turn off Zoom? I'll leave that to Megan.
And Megan said she saw a couple of hands raised. So, you know, do you want to, have you posted your comment in the Q&A? Or did you get your comment answered?
Ruth, it looks like hands have gone down, so that may have been on accident at this point, or maybe we addressed the questions. But yes, we will also be able to capture the Q&A box as well. And like Ruth had said, ASH is releasing our tobacco industry interference index in June, or that may be May actually, and we'll also be releasing an updated version of our US tobacco lobbyist and lobbying registration firm tracker, which will tell you the names of either the individuals or the lobbying firms in each state. And so when you're talking with policymakers, you'll know who to tell them basically not to trust or not to work with specifically. So that update is also coming very soon as well.
Well, I would just like to say thank you for the great participation on the call, and thank you for all the good topics that were raised, which provide more food for thought as we kind of continue this exploration. We have one more in this webinar series, which is, let me just find the date, or maybe somebody can help me with that. Oh, at May 24th. Is our next and last webinar in this series. And this will be presented by the upEND team. And Patricia or Libby, do you want to do a little plug for that webinar, which is continuing the Everybody Needs to Quit theme?
Yeah, so this one will be about the state and how the state is gonna have some problems to solve when it quits tobacco. So I can't promise all the answers, but I think we'll at least be raising a lot of interesting questions about how the state's going to have to confront that moving forward.
I think this is one of the things that's been so great about talking about Endgame on a regular and ongoing basis, is that you begin to realize there are really things that we have to start doing now. If we really believe that this is possible to do, and I do, and hopefully all of you do too, then we really have to start looking at those hard questions and planning for these things and saying, what do we need to do that we haven't already done to prepare? So, I see Megan posted the registration link for part 4. So I'd like to thank Chris for a great presentation, and thanks to all of you for excellent discussion and comments, and we will hope to see you in May.
Thanks, everyone.